Mrs. Matthews.
Motion to suspend the rules to add an agenda item.
Motion made and seconded to suspend the rules to accept an item. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? Carries.
Motion to approve the MOU between the Marlborough School Committee and the Marlborough Teachers Association for a 3-year MOU starting September 1st, 2018, extending to August 30th, 2021. We reviewed it in executive session and approved it. And I'd like to make a motion to approve it in public session.
Motion made and seconded to approve. Any discussion? Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? Carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Madam Superintendent.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. We'd like to thank the school committee, of course, for their continued support throughout the year and at this very important time of budget. We'd also like to extend our thanks to all of those sitting here tonight, principals and other members of the leadership team with whom we met before presenting this budget. So thank you so much for being here. As you can see, this is a lean budget in terms of asks for new FTEs, only one, and that is in keeping with the continuing plan to add 2 translators per building until we reach the full complement of 2 per building. So with this addition, it will be from 6 this year to 8 translators. And we have swapped out a no longer needed district position to make this happen. The word here is swap outs. Mr. Bergeron did ask that all requests from principals and others have a swap out embedded in there so that we could keep this as a lean budget. You'll see in the packet we have included the asks from both Richer and the high school. We expect that there will likely be additional swap outs, but we are expecting to hold at the 2.88% bottom line for this budget. We have received no questions at this point, and I know we've been interrupted a lot by snow and so on, but after Mr. Bergeron has finished with this presentation, we can certainly take your pertinent questions, and if we can't answer them, we have capable folks in the audience who can. We anticipate more of a focus on the what than the how, as there are still some scheduling requests to complete at the high school. As a matter of fact, high school students are right in the thick of completing their requests at this point. We also have brought forth Principal Caleri to talk a bit about scheduling and teaming a few meetings ago, as well as Principal Daniels to talk about the swap outs for the world language to reading teachers when he presented his intervention plan. The bottom line is that we are presenting this year a very lean budget, and we'll do so again next year in anticipation of a heftier FY21 with the need for a new bus contract, and of course what's on everyone's mind is the opening of a new school. Predictable and sustainable are the watchwords. We've talked about that over and over again, and you will hear them with resounding, knells all the time from Mr. Bergeron. We hope that this session helps you see that that is our plan moving forward, and we certainly welcome any questions that you have at the end. Mr. Bergeron?
Thank you. One thing I just want to try to mention before we start is the overall strategy of what we're trying to do over the next 3 years. So we understand that although the Finance Committee has approved moving the bond forward for City Council, there's still votes to be taken. But trying to plan ahead for FY21, we understand that there's some expenses that are going to be above and beyond our regular school budget. I just want to take a moment. We're going to talk about it later, but just take a moment to talk about why we're trying to be as lean as we are in the next 2 years, getting to that point. So not only with opening the new school, we're anticipating just under about $1 million increase for operational expenses to open the school. And that's going to be items in our operational budget that are then going to persist year after year. So we're going to need additional administration. We're going to need office support. We're going to need custodians. So there's going to be a lot of requests that we'll be bringing forward in the FY21 budget that will then continue on from that point forward. In addition, as Superintendent mentioned, our bus contract, while incredibly favorable to us right now in terms of cost, is going to increase, almost regardless of who the bidders are. And I'll go over this later in the budget as well. But we can anticipate a cost of increase of between $400,000 and $500,000 just for the bus contract if we maintain the service and the fleet that we have right at this moment. So there are some questions over the next few years that we need to tackle and answer. There are some policy questions that we're going to have to tackle and answer about our district's responsibility for transportation. We're going to have to talk about class sizes at the elementary level. So there's a lot of work that's going to get us to that point. But trying to have a basis of, a real budget that we can get support of, knowing that in a few years we're going to have a pretty expensive ask of the city council. And that's part of the strategy that we've been talking about, is trying to maintain our services, move things appropriately when we need to. That's what we're really talking about. Swap outs is taking existing resources and move them to where we need them for the current time. So all of this kind of builds together to looking into the future. So our first slide really just talks about our level service budget calculations. I just want to go over each of them in a little bit of detail, just so we can all understand what these cost increases or decreases come from. The first line that you see says salary reserve for negotiations with bargaining units. It's a little over $1.5 million. That's because all but one of our contracts are up right now. The only contract that we currently have that is settled is the custodian's contract, which is through next year. All of our other contracts are up. In fact, the vote you just took now reduces this 1.5 million down to much less than that, because now I can take those funds and distribute them to the appropriate lines. So as we've been going along this dual track, we have an A budget and a B budget. We've been keeping two budgets that we've been working on, and I'll be able, now that the vote is taken, to be able to send you the revised budget with the new figures. However, can't determine that you're going to say yes to everything, so I had to leave it as it is for tonight. But I can update these figures and send them to you later on. The next piece is the retirement turnover savings. That is known retirements that, because of the contract stipulation in the MEA contract, that they give us notice of retirement, and then by December 1st, if they haven't pulled it back, it's pretty much set in stone. So we know that certain folks are going to retire, and we can anticipate those savings in next year's operating budget. As you know, for the past 4 years that I've been working here, we've always tried to budget $65,000 for a replacement teacher, knowing that sometimes we may hire a little bit lower, sometimes we hire a little bit higher, but generally we stay in that range if you look at all the hires combined. That's helped, I think, the district not always go for whatever the lowest candidate is on the, in terms of experience and education, but get the right candidate. And it gives the principals a little bit of leeway as far as their hiring decisions beyond, some districts that I've been part of has always been, you can hire whichever candidate is B1. Whichever one you want, as long as they're in bachelor step 1. So by budgeting the $65,000, that gives us a lot of leeway. But even with that $65,000 budget, we're still able to get quite a bit of savings in the operating budget to offset our overall costs. We do have expected administrative turnover savings. I won't go into great detail, but obviously with the superintendent retiring, I'll be moving into that position, someone will be replacing me. We anticipate that we're going to have administrative turnover savings within that budget. That has already been deducted from the salary reserve that we have in the budget. So that piece is already taken care of. When we have this line called FY18 changes, it's our lane changes, turnover costs, and hires above budget. That's in our present budget. Sometimes we have to make a move to either increase a service, decrease a service, or pay for lane changes that are in the actual year that we're in. So of that 182,000, 140 of it is simply for lane changes. That's what that cost is for. The rest is just for some small changes that we've had to make to accommodate a request from a principal, whether it be for additional classes or move a 0.6 to a 0.8 FTE, or things like that during the year that we just have to take care of to meet the needs of the students. Increase of general supplies, which in the budget, if you look, it's the 70503 lines. That is just due to our enrollment increasing. So whenever we have an increase in enrollment, which we'll talk about in a moment, we are now on a per pupil basis for our general supplies and instructional materials. So one thing that we've done, which is nice, is now that's very kind of predictable. You just look at your November 1 enrollment, and if you have more students, you get more supply money. If you have less students, you get a little bit less supply money. And it makes it easier to kind of budget for, because every principal can look at that and say, if I'm in the elementary, I know I have $60 per kid. If I have 600 students, I have $36,000 to work with to plan for the next year. Same thing for the instructional materials, which is the next line down. So those vary by grade and by level. So at some levels, we put there's more per student because of the needs. So for example, at the high school, the science allotment per pupil is higher than it is at the elementary level, because the costs of the science materials at the high school are a lot more expensive. But when you look at the whole district, the 12,209 is just to recognize the changes in some enrollment. We did have a bump in enrollment, which we'll talk about. But the good news is the bump in enrollment also comes with additional Chapter 70 money. So there's a positive to it as well. The transportation contract. One thing I want to point out about this, although it's increasing $165,000, $100,000 of that, or 98 and change, is to pay for 2 buses that we've added this year for AMSA, the charter school, to be able to make sure that they can get their students to and from school in a reasonable amount of time. I know we've talked about that quite a bit, but I just want to remind you that really the $65,000 is kind of the level service for our budgets, which is us looking at about a 2.3% increase on our costs. Right now, because we have extended the bus contract, our bus contract will increase by whatever the CPI increase is for the Northeast region. It's capped at 2.5%. It's also capped on the bottom end at 0. So we anticipate there's going to be an increase. I think it's going to be a little high this year, as the employment, labor costs, and fuel costs have risen a little bit. But we have that budgeted, so we're safe on that end. But again, that's something that, looking into the future, that's going to have to be a decision we want to make about transportation services moving forward, because those are going to become much more expensive in FY21, and depending on how we want to bid it and how we want the policy of transportation to run for the whole district is going to determine those costs moving forward. The last line is the tuition decrease for out-of-district placements. Each year, we're very fortunate, I believe, here in Marlborough, because working with our city officials, working with everyone, we've been able to build up an entire year's worth of reserve in circuit breaker, which allows us to budget what our actuals are for out-of-district placements. A lot of districts will take this line, and what they'll do is they will build in what they know, and then additionally they'll tell their school boards or governance boards that they need additional monies for unknown. So they'll budget 3 or 4 private placements and possibly a couple 45-day placements on top of that. We don't do that. So we budget what we know, what we expect, but nothing in terms of any extra, because we have the circuit breaker money that's in reserve to protect us. So what that allows us to do is, when I work with Jody O'Brien, who's the Director of Student Services, and we look at our out-of-district placements, we are only budgeting what we anticipate will actually happen the next year. There's no extra placements budgeted into here. So it does give us a little bit of room here, where sometimes if you have some kids who are either aging out or moving on to a different program, leaving the state, we can get those savings back to our budget. But what we have to recognize is, whenever we reduce our costs in our district placement, the next year our circuit breaker is going to go down. So excuse me for one moment while I take a water break. And I'll go to the next slide. So over the past couple years, we've been paying for 4 positions in the district out of circuit breaker each year. And while at the time it was a decision that had to be made, and We've done it very well. We haven't had any issues. We believe this is the year we want to bring it back. There's a couple reasons for that. One is the circuit breaker revenue was dropped from 72% to 65% this last year. So I look at that and I say, okay, if they're starting to drop the reimbursement rate of circuit breaker, this is the time right now to pull back those expenses, because this is one-time money if you really think about it. So we don't want one-time funds, paying for ongoing operational expenses like salaries. That's the worst thing you can do, because you might get into a double cut situation where if your operating budget goes down and circuit breaker gets reduced, you're now faced with having to make two cuts. So what we're asking for here is to move those 4 positions that we've been paying for circuit breaker back into the operational budget. We've had them for 3 years now. They've sustained themselves. We want to move them into the operating budget, and then that also will free up the money we've been paying from circuit breaker over time. It also makes us a little bit more immune to potential, whether it be a 9C cut, whether it be the legislature not fully funding circuit breaker. It just makes us a little bit more immune to what I refer to as like your liabilities out there. Because we don't know exactly what's going to happen on that state level, so we want to protect ourselves as much as possible. This is also why for when we had the large grant for our STEM equipment, and also when we've been taking in revenue from our agreement with the Cambridge Institute, we've taken students in from China into our high school. We didn't tie operational expenses to those as best we could. So I'll talk about the YCC grant in a moment, but we were very focused on trying to make sure that when these grants end, or when these revenues end, that we don't get stuck kind of holding the bag of the operational expense. That's something that has happened to districts in the past, and they get into kind of a tough situation if the revenue suddenly ends and then they have to pick up the excess. So moving those positions from circuit breaker to the budget costs $218,000, and that would mean that they're fully in the operational budget moving forward, which is what we want to see. The loss of circuit breaker revenue, there's 2 pieces to that. One is we've been spending less money, which is good. And the second thing is that our revenue is trending down a little bit because of the percentage. So when they went from 72% to 65% reimbursement, that had an effect on us as well. So we lost a little bit of revenue year to year, but part of it was anticipated because our costs also went down. So you can anticipate again next year, when we're looking at this same exact and having the same exact conversation, I just told you in the last slide that our out-of-district expenses are going to go down about $800,000. Well, next year we're going to reduce that circuit breaker revenue again. So that's how it's going to keep going year to year to year. The key is for us to be very strategic about it if we know that's going to happen. So, for example, right now we know that looking out into the future, we have probably 7 or 8 residential students out of the district right now. Most of those students, I'd say 7 out of 8 of them, are 18 years or older. Okay, so if we look at that and let's think strategically about it, over time, if we don't replace those students with other students in residential programs, those expenses will be coming off our budget. But what that means is we're also going to lose the reimbursement the year after that happens. So in year 1, everyone's a budget hero. In year 2, you're going to make up the revenue you just lost. So when we're looking at this, we need to be very strategic year to year to make sure that we don't add a whole bunch of operational expenses when we lose that revenue. In fact, we should really hold it and wait for the year after and then let it go. Because that would be the way to actually strategically do it, to make sure that we don't have any large jumps in our budget, okay? So the loss of YCC grant revenue, the $40,948, well, the loss is not a loss like a bad thing. We knew this was going to happen. The grant's going to end eventually, and we were going to have to carry on any expenses that we've started. So the $40,948 is to continue a position that we created at the high school, which is a guidance counselor, but also someone who helps us with the early college program. And it's a .6 position. It's the only position that we really have funded through the grant, and it's the position we want to keep in our operating budget moving forward, the importance of it, I mean, we could talk about that for the next 2 hours, so the importance of the early college program, and I was lucky enough to sit there last night and listen to all the great work that's happening. We really want to sustain that position moving forward. So luckily, we haven't spent that grant on so many operational items that we have to carry forward. A lot of it was equipment that we've bought that we have to maintain, but it's not something that we have to then replace right away in the next year's budget. The loss of Title II revenue. This is more of a projection based upon information that I've seen in the federal budgets. However, I can tell you that there is debate on this. So we're anticipating that at some point, the Title II-A money, which it used to be called a long time ago the Eisenhower Grant, and then it was the Class Size Reduction Grant. So generally, it's used for elementary schools to reduce their class sizes. And that's pretty much what most districts in the state use it for. And they also use a piece of it for professional development. Those are the two main purposes of the grant. So when we look at the $135,000, that's supporting 2 teachers right now in the public schools that we are taking back into our operating budget because we're not budgeting the grant revenues for next year. We still have to wait to see what exactly is going to come out, but based on what I've read, so when I looked over the federal budget and I pulled it down and I read through it, they reduced the entirety of the Title II grant to instead create competitive block grants for school choice. So when I read that, I talked to Mary, we've gone back and forth on this a bunch of times, and we're just not 100% sure that it's gonna be there next year. So we don't wanna rely on it, because the worst thing we can do is rely on the grant revenues, have it come out next year that they're not gonna be there, and then we have to make a decision locally about whether or not we're gonna fund it, or what are we gonna reduce to fund it. That's really what it comes down to. So we're a little conservative on this end, I'll be honest about it. I think, you know, if we look at most of our peers in this area, most of the people are still relying upon that for the next year. I'm a little bit more conservative. I don't think going forward, Title II is gonna be a program that is gonna be in the federal entitlement grants.
And Mike, these are the only 2 areas we have federal funding from, correct?
We have federal funding from a couple sources, and one is gonna be our Title I grant. So Title I is a larger grant than this one. Title II is only about $136,000. Title I is about $765,000. And then IDEA, which supports special education spending, that's about $1.3 million. One of my last slides in the budget kind of goes over this federal piece, and really, we need to think about this in terms of reducing our risk. And when I get to that slide, I'll talk about what we can do, or maybe over the next couple of years, to start to reduce our risk when it comes to these federal grants. One of the things that's hard about the federal grants is that we won't know until July and sometimes August what our actual allotment's gonna be. So we have to plan, and I like to plan conservatively, that we're gonna get in a little bit less. And that's why you see here that additionally, we think we're gonna lose a little bit of Title I revenue. Not jumping ahead, I'll show you on a slide over the past 3 years, but over the past 3 years, we've lost more than $200,000 in Title I funds. IDEA has remained relatively static. It actually increased a little bit. In Title II, I'm anticipating that whole thing is gone. So really, when we look at this slide, it's just we have to recognize the revenues as well as the expenses. A lot of these items are revenues that, you know, going forward, we can't rely on to keep paying for operational items. So the next slide, which this one's much smaller, these are our new positions. We're asking for 2 new positions in the district. This has been an ongoing, wrong button. We've been talking about this for some time. I think for at least 3 budgets, we've been discussing our plan on how we're going to be rolling out translators district-wide and trying to get to a place where we have translators available in each of our schools, in each of the buildings. So we're asking for 2 additional translators. This directly relates to our goal 2, which is trying to, again, create capacity to involve parents in the community. It's not just the translations of the actual documents when it comes to IEPs or progress reports or communications that we're sending home. There's more to it. We want to be able to have communication during the day with our parents who may not speak English, and this allows us to continue to expand that program. So you can anticipate in next year's budget, we'll ask for an additional 2. And then to open the new school, in the figures that I had presented in that $1 million that we need to open the new school, there are 2 translators in that request as well. So we continue moving it forward year after year. To do that, we do have to make a reduction in the budget to try to keep ourselves as level as possible. And after conferring with Jody O'Brien, we believe that we have enough services in the district with BCBA's that we can reduce 1 across the district and still keep the same level of services. So although we're still trying to remain very conservative, we do have to reduce positions, be able to add positions across the district. So, although this can be a little bit tough to see, maybe from your seat, that's why I put on the top. This is our district enrollment from the past 2 years. So what you can see is, 1, it's been very consistent. We haven't had too many large jumps. But 2, we have had an enrollment increase from October to October. We're up 1.3% overall, and that's reflected in our Chapter 70 numbers, which I'll go over at the end of these slides to talk about. So overall, district-wide, pretty consistent, small increase. As I go through, I want to talk about what that increase entails, because there's many different factors included in that. The first thing I want to talk about is our district low-income enrollment. So since September 1st of 2016, we've had a 30% increase in our number of students who would be either free or reduced lunch. Now, in district, you remember a couple years ago, I started talking about economically disadvantaged. Okay, I'm talking about free and reduced. So I want to make that clear. Because economically disadvantaged from the state, that's how they're using their figures. But we still capture and collect the data to make sure we know exactly how many students are on free or reduced lunch. So I'm looking at these figures and I'm presenting them. That's what I'm talking about, okay? So the students who we refer to as economically disadvantaged, and you see on the DESE website, those are students who are receiving some sort of state service, whether it be Mass Health or SNAP or any of those programs. They automatically get put into our system for free lunch. This also, what I'm presenting now, also includes all of the parents in our community who've also filled out the paper application to be able to be eligible for free and reduced lunch.
Because they may not be getting the service.
Absolutely. But you can still, even though you
Right.
may not get it from the state, you can still fill out our application
Right.
and still receive services from us. The next slide is our district EL student enrollment. Actually, I had updated this from what I put in the budget because we had new numbers and I wanted to reflect what was the best information at the time. So our EL student enrollment since September 1st of 2016, we've had a 42% increase of the number of students who need EL services. Last year, if you remember in the budget, we saw that this was coming and we made a large investment. So if you remember in last year's budget, almost all of the new requests were related to our EL program, whether it was adding paraprofessionals at both the high school and the middle school. We also added EL teachers. We've added quite a few services over the past couple of years to be able to try to service this as best we can. So one of the things is, as we're looking at these programs, what we have to discuss and what needs to come forward is with the new look bill, we're going to have discussions about what are we going to do with our EL services and programs. Are we going to look into potentially having a bilingual option where students are being instructed in both English and possibly Spanish? Is that something that we're gonna be doing? So that work is gonna be ongoing. We're going to have to really study this and determine if that is part of our plan moving forward, or are we going to continue with the model we have? And what do we need to do to support that model moving forward? Those are all questions that we need to consider. But as you can see in these figures, this is not really slowing down. So we're going to need to continually invest in the programs to make sure that we can service the kids as best we can. So one thing I'd like to point out is that our special education student enrollment has decreased since September 1st of 2016. We've actually decreased 7.5%. I'd love to get into a whole spiel about why that is, although I'm not as qualified as Jody O'Brien to really talk about that. But when you see numbers like this, really what it comes down to as a district is making sure that we're not over-identifying students for special education, that we're putting in core, consistent curriculum, we're adding interventions, so that way the students never have to get to the point of having an IEP. It's just part of our philosophy. If we can introduce a rigorous curriculum in the Tier 1, what we've been talking about for a while now, and then also offer those supports in Tier 2, then you will have less students who are moving forward to an IEP because they will be, on grade level for most of their academics. So I think when you look at these figures, it's kudos to the special education department for doing a good job of not over-identifying, but also how are we investing in our programs? That's in the budget book, I talked about that. So my feeling, I hope it's a shared feeling, is that we're not building the programs in district only to make sure we don't send kids out of district. We want to service kids as best we can in our district. So investing in building in our district the programs we have is a huge benefit to us. That necessarily doesn't relate to these figures, but it's a philosophy that we're bringing forward and continuing to work on. So maybe at the next presentation, Jody can talk about what these numbers reflect and where where at certain levels are we higher or lower. When I dig into the data, I see there's spike grades. At 5th grade, all of a sudden there's a spike. There's a lot of kids who are on IEPs in 5th grade. Why is that? Is it the transition year? There's lots of questions that we can grapple with and try to determine, are we doing the right thing? But this is rather positive news, looking at it from the whole district point of view. Our elementary student enrollment, if you believe it or not, it's a 0% increase October to October. However, it has remained relatively consistent at about 400 per grade level, which is why we're having some of our issues right now with space. So, for example, when we look at the JARC school, they're maxed out on their capacity of classrooms. So even if we wanted to add teachers, it's really troubling right now, and that's why we're in the process we're in to ask for the new school, so that way we can level out the playing field and get room in all of the schools moving forward. Although there's been a 0% increase over time, we are stretching the boundaries in every school. We don't have art in every elementary school in a classroom. We don't have music in a classroom. We've eliminated our computer labs altogether across the way. We're still struggling to service students in appropriate places. We're doing the best we can, but there is some rooms have to be divided so that way we can provide multiple services at once. So all these things lead us into our building project and our argument that while the enrollment has not changed significantly, the way we need to use our buildings is much different than they were intended for and what they were built for. Looking at our Wickham student enrollment, we've had about a 2% increase October to October, and actually it has even increased beyond that. So from this October, we've added an additional 33 students on top of that. So it's actually more than 2% over that whole time, but from October to October, we have about a 2% increase. At the high school, we had a 2.8% increase from October to October. And again, looking at the data, we've enrolled even a couple more students from them. So it's probably closer to 3% at this time, looking at the totals.
Like, is that dip there because of post-graduation? Is that the
Yeah, so
classes
what
gone, so
happens,
you lose that whole
you
year?
see that dip, is when we remove all the
I'm just looking at
seniors.
the date, that's why.
So
No
graduation,
grades there.
back to school.
Yeah, right.
This is our early childhood student enrollment. We've had a 5.3% increase October to October. And this really shows the demand that's actually going on right now for this program. We're struggling filling, we could fill a lot more slots if we had the room and if we had the FTEs to be able to support it. So right now, we're over 200 students at the ECC in total, and we're really struggling. We don't have any more room. So we have to, obviously, with the building project and everything we've talked about, we are looking to move administration out of this building and then open up some more room for the preschool to grow a little bit. But still, this is an ongoing demand, and I think this is part of our long-term strategy. If we really want to narrow the opportunity gap, people call it the achievement gap, but it's really about opportunities for kids. If you want to narrow that, early childhood is the best investment you can make. And I think that's pretty much a universal, everybody agrees about that. So that's something that I think we can look at in the future and try to determine how can we, in a long-term plan, be able to invest in ECC and really maybe get to a point of, it can't be universal because there's not enough room, but what can we do with the tuition structures? Can we offer more full-day options? What can we do with 4-year-olds? There's a lot of great data about if 4-year-olds have access to a half-day or at least a 3/4 day program, they are so much more ready for kindergarten. There's less likely that they're going to be in an IEP. There's a higher percent they're going to graduate high school. The statistics are amazing when it comes to if you can get services for 4-year-olds in your community. Excuse me. So at Hildreth, it's obviously the bars are a little bit easier to see on this one because there's less students over there. But we've had a 1.6% increase October to October, but the enrollment at Hildreth does flux a little bit at times. And it does build up over the year as the year goes on, as some students move into the program. So there is, a little bit of a demand for this, but not much more than the high school as on its own. So about the same. At the very end is 59 students, yeah. So when we look at the elementary class sizes, looking at this as a total, I see one glaring thing right off the bat that I think we're going to address in the budget and we're going to look at, and that's the Kane grade 4 for next year at 25.5. That's obviously, if you look at all of our class sizes, that's probably the one that sticks out the most as probably being the outlier. At Jarrick, with the 35 classrooms, we're going to be adding a Pathways classroom next year. So even if we wanted to add an 8th teacher, we have room constraints at this point at Jarrick. But looking at the average class size, it's not where we want to be, but it's not so high that we're too concerned at this point. Really, the concern that I have is with the Kane grade 4. Based on the projections on where we are right now, we've already settled one contract, which happens to be our largest contract. And moving forward, I feel pretty confident that we can fund that 4th grade teacher position right now. So I know it's a concern, and it's a concern to all of us when we look at that. But as we're sitting right now with our existing resources and not asking above the 2.88, I think that we can fund that 4th grade position for next year and lower that class size down. If we did that, I think if you look across the elementary, we have pretty good class sizes. I don't see anything that is really sticking out above and beyond that. The disclaimer that we always make is, we're doing kindergarten registration right now. We're getting the data in. It's too early to tell. We need a little bit more time to look at it and get, time for parents to actually come and enroll. But that's usually the disclaimer, right? It looks good from right now, and we've been using kind of this to project out, but we don't know exactly what kindergarten is going to look like for next year. Based on these figures, it looks like we have enough FTE to cover what we have, and we have still pretty good class sizes across the district. So we would be adding one teacher to this. We have 92 elementary teachers. We'd be adding one, make it 93. And I think that would solve most of our elementary class size issues for next year, with the obvious disclaimer about kindergarten. I just want to touch upon state aid real quick. So we did have an increase in students. So although it's a little hard to see, The change in overall enrollment was an increase of 79 students. That's our October 1 submission to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. What we do is we send them our information, but they're also counting students who are outside the district. So for example, if there's anyone who's choicing over to Hudson, if there are any choice students in other programs, all of those get counted into the Chapter 70 profile for us to gain funds back. So when we look at that overall increase of 79, it doesn't mean we increase 79. It means that our total population of students that we count for Chapter 70 has increased 79. The good news is with that increase and our increasing populations of certain demographics, whether it be low-income students or EL students, that this is the governor's budget, just remember that, but the increase is about $1.9 million in Chapter 70, which is good. That's, like most communities are basically getting $25 a pupil. So if we were looking at that, we would be looking at $250,000 in additional state aid. But because we're a foundation district and every student we add is going to send money our way, this is why we're seeing more of the increases than other districts around us whom are basically capped off at that $25 per pupil rate. And they're not going to change. Doesn't matter how many pupils they add, they're still going to be capped off at that rate. So that's a good news story. So looking ahead, I've already kind of talked about some pieces of this. This picture is a nighttime picture of the new school. That's at Athol, and ours is going to look remarkably similar to this one, as we have chosen the model school program. So looking ahead, we understand that project, while not yet voted by City Council and not yet voted by MSBA, however, when we look at that as a long-term goal, it's definitely something that we have to prepare for. So the first thing I want to show you, and the school committee has already seen this, I presented this, I think, a couple months ago. When we went out with Hudson to bid on the bus contract to try to see maybe if you put two communities together, maybe that'll give us a little bit more, bang for our buck. We can pool our resources and get better pricing. We didn't see too much of the better pricing that we wanted to see, so we renewed our contract. But in the same time that I was doing that, I pulled other communities to see what their per bus cost was so we could compare. So eventually we can get to the point where we can see what our cost increase will be. So right now we're paying a little over $290 a bus, just for a yellow bus, which is our normal size bus.
Is that a day?
Yes. So when we look at that, it's $290 for a 3-tier. That means it's taking 3 different runs in the AM and PM for a yellow bus. For our mini buses, it's actually $297 because we added those after we did the original contract, and that shows you very quickly how the costs increased over 1 year. From we signed the contract and then we decided to move away from the van model and go to the mini bus model, and the mini buses jumped in price by almost $20 that 1 year. So when we look at other communities, Framingham $401, Leominster $457. The only asterisk on Leominster is they do 4 runs instead of 3. But even Lincoln Sudbury at $330 is very low, and that's just 1 run. They have 1 run. So if they were doing 2 more runs, the cost to the bus companies is labor. That's what really is driving these costs up. They know what their capital costs are. They know what they can buy a bus for. They're going to buy fuel futures. They're going to protect themselves against all of that. The cost that we're talking about is the labor of the drivers. That is what has been going up across all of the districts. As we know, you've probably seen in town, NRT has been advertising in billboards all over town, $4,000 bonus. If you sign on, we'll help you get your commercial driver license. And when you get that, they'll give you a $4,000 bonus to sign on to the job, which is about 25% of the total compensation they're probably paying for the job. That shows you how much the competition effects are really going on in that industry right now. It has been a struggle for us. We have, even today, we still have 2 sub drivers on routes. And that has been difficult. They're doing their job, trying to recruit people and even paying these outlandish bonuses in some way, and they're still struggling to get people into these jobs. We do have a very low unemployment rate, and I think in Marlborough, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think in Marlborough it's even lower than some of the state figures. I think it's about 2%, unless I'm understanding that wrong.
A little bit over, not much.
A little bit over 2%. Great, okay. So when we look at this cost, we're gonna anticipate that our cost of our transportation will probably increase about 2.5% for 2 years in a row. And then going into FY '21, we're gonna see a much larger percent increase. We're gonna see potential bus, bids come in between 360 and 380 is kind of what we're trying to project out. So if we're looking at that as a total, and we're looking at almost a 20% cost increase, 25% cost increase, it's gonna be a significant addition to our budget. So one of the questions, we're not gonna solve it tonight, but one of the questions we need to start talking about is our transportation policy of everybody gets a ride, especially at the elementary level. We have to start talking about that, because if there are opportunities where we could create walking zones, that could potentially reduce the number of buses we have in total, and that might reduce our total hit in FY '21 when we get to that point. Because the costs are going up one way or the other, it's really about how we're going to try to manage it. So I think that's not a discussion that we can solve tonight. I think it's something that we probably need to put a lot of time and research into, to look at each neighborhood specifically and determine whether it's safe, whether it's accessible, and whether it's reasonable for us to ask parents and families to do that. And I think if we look at each school independently, I think we can come up with some solutions to be able to lower our total number of buses, but not really restrict the service. The next thing I wanted to talk about was projected costs for the new elementary school. So one thing that, when we look at this, obviously, we're trying to project not knowing every single detail, but given the fact that our elementary enrollment has been so consistent, so unbelievably consistent, we can pretty much predict out that we're gonna have about 400 students at each level going into that year, K through 5. Sometimes there's a little bit less at 5, but we can predict that out. So when we're looking at this and we're trying to project out some of the costs, a lot of the teaching costs are already in our budget. So for example, the 5th grade team that's at Whitcomb, the 16 teachers, that's gonna have to be distributed out among the elementary schools. We have, if we add the 1 FTE to Kane, like we were just talking about, to relieve that pressure on that class size, we have an additional 93 teachers that will be able to distribute among the buildings to be able to have good class sizes at every building. So if you look at that together, we have just under 110 educators for these buildings, and we've projected it out. We looked at a couple different models. It gives us actually a pretty good class size, about 20 across the board. So when we see that, and we see the ability to then gain back all of the space that we need, whether it be not just art and music, but having appropriate space at all the buildings for EL services, having appropriate space at all the buildings for pullout. One of the things in the new building that we're very excited about are these ability to have clusters and have the new area where you can have pullout services in there. But having that area doesn't mean that in the new building we still won't have dedicated EL space. And that's something that we really have looked at, and we're very excited for when we get to that point, because we're gonna be able to have the appropriate spaces to be able to, pull students out and do that small group instruction. So when we look at this, you don't see a lot of classroom teaching positions. We have 3 FTE in the budget, and that's more of a placeholder depending on kindergarten enrollment. How do we really project that? And if there is gonna be any place where you wanna invest, you're gonna wanna invest in the kindergarten across all the buildings to lower that class size. So when we look at it, again, we'll need a principal, assistant principal, office support, custodian, psychologist, translators. You could potentially need a physical education teacher, a couple classroom teachers, potentially, depending on how everything moves out. Instructional technology specialist. Right now, we only have 3 in the district. So if you look at the enrollment, what you would have if you kept the 3 is you'd have one at the high school, there's about 1,070 kids. If you kept one at the middle school, there'll be a little bit less than 1,000 kids at the Whitcomb. But if you only have one for elementary level, there's going to be almost 2,400 students across 4 buildings. So we think that that's an appropriate investment to make. Additionally, for IT support, we need at a minimum probably a Chromebook tech, just to continue to make sure we can get to all the equipment we need to. Custodial supplies are minimal. That's just based on how many kids are in each building, and Andy and I pretty much look at that and say there might be a chance we even do away with that altogether by bidding out the supplies a little bit differently. So that's the minimal expense out of everything. But if you think about it, since we've gone to a per pupil model for instructional budgets and general supplies, we don't need to add any additional money. So what's going to happen is there's going to be a redistribution, and then there's also going to be a redistribution of the budget funds as well to each of those schools, depending on how many students they're going to have. So we don't need to budget any more money for general supplies, instructional materials, or any of those types of things. Additionally, within the budget project scope, there's what they call FF&E, furniture, fixtures, equipment, and that's going to pay for desks, it's going to pay for the projector, it's going to pay for all of those types of things. So we don't need to strip out of other buildings and create this mongrel classroom with all kinds of equipment that doesn't work together. We'll be able to have a new equipment in that building that we won't have to transfer any of those existing assets from other schools. The one thing we probably will have to transfer is Chromebooks. So if there's less students in the school, then maybe one of the carts from each of the schools goes over. So those are the types of things you would do, but not anything major. So one thing that I want to touch upon that actually the mayor had brought up earlier is our federal entitlement grants. And on the left-hand side, you can see the Title I revenue. So in FY16, we received $976,000 in Title I revenue. This year, we received $764,000. So even though that we have had those losses, we haven't necessarily reduced our FTE in the district. But we're afraid that as this continues, we're going to have to reduce our FTE in the district because a majority of our Title I spending is on teachers. And that's really what it's designed for, is to support low-income students, where we have such a high percentage that our entire school is qualified for the services. An IDEA, you see that actually it has gone up each year slightly. So that's a good news story, but over time, I can't anticipate that that's going to keep happening with the federal budgets that we've been seeing. So really, my questions are that to give to the committee for future thinking is, what are the operational costs that are tied to these grants? So when we look at Title I, a majority of the funding that we receive in district is going to be going straight towards teaching positions. In the IDEA grant, which is about $1.3 million, almost the entire grant goes towards transportation of students. So if the federal government cuts down on any of their spending, we still have to provide all those services. Like, we don't get to choose for the IDEA grant that we're just not going to do special ed transportation. That's not how it works. So what would happen is it would put a lot of pressure on us locally, which, again, the timing of these grants always happens in the summer after we've already approved our budget. We've already gone through that process. So my second question is, does that lead to uncertainty in our year-to-year budget? Yes, because we don't know what's going to happen until July or August. And by then, I'm sorry, it's too late because we've already taken the statutory votes. We can't then go back and change them. You're going to have to make adjustments within your budget year. The last question I have for the future, and we know where we're going to FY21. Past FY21, can we start to eliminate this liability over time? So my question and something I want to try to develop is there a way that we can pull some of the operational costs off incrementally, not all at once, it's too much money, but can we incrementally start to pull these liabilities away from the federal grants and put them back in our budget? So that way, these grants were always intended to be supplemental to your budget. That's the key. So the supplemental piece of this is really, we've tied operational expenses to this, but we're no different than any other district in the state. So it's not like we did something wrong. Everyone had to do this. This is the way that it went. But over time, can we make a longer-term plan to reduce that liability by taking back the operational expense and truly making these supplemental? So that way, if the federal government swings from time to time, that we don't have to reduce service to the kids. That these truly would be supplemental grants that we could use to, I'm sorry, hit the button too quick. That supplemental grants that we could use to try to close that opportunity gap for kids over time. So that finishes my presentation. I know there's probably some questions. So
Questions from the committee, Ms. Matthews?
Actually, on that last slide that you just showed, you may not know this off the top of your head, but I know over time, and even in the 6 years that I've been a school committee member, we've reduced our dependency overall on operational spending on grants or funding. But in comparison to other districts, is there a way of knowing? Where-
It's hard to look at that because the way the entitlement grants come out is that Marlborough may get a much higher share of Title I revenue than Hudson, for example. And that's based upon the demographics of our kids. So we might be gaining a lot more revenue on that side, just based on that factor. So more or less, you would instead look at Marlborough in a cohort of alike districts. And that's something that I could probably pull data down to see how much Title I are our like districts getting as opposed to their total operating budget.
Because I guess one of my, I don't know, I'm not gonna say fear, but if I mean, you're talking about $2 million that would have to be absorbed over time, which presumably one's gonna come down a little bit and one may increase. So, I mean, it may stay at, it hasn't been much more than, well, just a little bit over 2 million. And those services are still gonna need to continue. And as you said, if it does increase and you've already tucked it into your operating budget,
That means that we get more supplemental money to do what we're supposed to be doing,
right,
which is close that gap.
the gap.
And also support all the students. The IDA money should be supporting students with disabilities. So it should be supporting them accessing the curriculum in their local district and trying to get them progress on their goals. You know, I mean, the Title I revenue is supposed to be supplemental, and it really is supplemental. I'm not saying it's not here, because if all the Title I revenue went away, the problem with us is we would just have less interventions in the district overall, and that would be harmful to us.
Well, I guess, because, well, and I get that, but in a perfect world, if we had the $2 million extra today and said, okay, we're gonna throw that right into our operating budget, and now we're looking at a supplemental, there's not enough minutes in the day to provide the additional over and above. So that's where I get a little like, ugh. Where do you find that balance of providing the services we're supposed to provide, with or without the grant money? Because we have to do it. We're not gonna take it away because we don't have it, and we can't give much more than the time allowed.
Yeah, and part of the problem is because we've been reducing our Title I revenue over time, unfortunately, we have had to make reductions in our programs. I'll give you a perfect example. We won't be running a Title I summer school this fiscal year.
Okay.
So really, this has had an impact on us. We've been trying to keep the positions in the school because we feel like that intervention piece is very important, but we have had to give up other pieces
Okay,
outside
so that's a
of
good
that.
example of the over and above, the extra minutes in the day.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So, thank you.
Other questions? Ms. Hennessy?
So following on that, we've had this conversation long before you were even here about how we've had a lot of money earmarked for staff with Title I. We've got to pare it back because hearing that, I mean, I understand, dollars and cents, but hearing that we're going to have to give up the Title I summer program, that's a huge loss to when we're talking about some of our enrollment, and we're talking about some of our kids in need, The basic data that the normal layman knows is the summer is when those kids lose the most. So we have to find ways of starting to take some of that into our operational budget, or we're just looking at hurting ourselves for trying to make achievement, happen. So I mean, I think when we get to the point and we find out how much money then in the summer we're going to end up with each year, then I think we need to have another conversation around the table. What can we then earmark towards certain things? Because those are services that obviously have helped our students to, at minimum, maintain over the last number of years. So, on that. There are a few slides that we didn't necessarily have copies of. So can
give you
you,
a copy of this,
that
yeah.
would be very helpful.
I updated all the slides for this.
Yeah,
Because it had more
Yeah.
recent data that was in the budget book, and I wanted to provide that.
completely get it. It just would be helpful because we were trying to follow that way, but some of us that are visually challenged were having a tough time. A question back on the bus situation. So, just as a for instance, we had added those 2 buses for supporting the charter school. And a question that I have, which we've had some conversation about, are the over-enrollment numbers that are happening at AMSA. I'm just curious because I know that we are over our cap, if you will, of what Marlborough then needs to pay out financially to support. Is there a differential that we get back from the state to support the transportation money that we need to lay out to make sure that we're supporting them? That's that difference, if you will.
We don't receive any reimbursement for transportation. So what happens is the reimbursement for the tuition flows to the city because the city pays the tuition.
Right.
And that goes on the cherry sheet to the cherry sheet is the Department of Revenue 2-pager that has your expenses and your revenues. And that flows to the city, but the transportation costs of any public charter school in Massachusetts is the responsibility of the home district, but not for any of the other districts outside. So we don't receive reimbursement for that, and they have not reimbursed regular education and transportation since the 1970s,
Okay.
to my knowledge.
I just was trying to understand about that over-enrollment number, and that's where I was wondering. So, okay, thank you. Substitutes within the district, are we trying to continue to have that on a more regular basis to help make sure that we have, we're able to make sure things are covered? Because I know that had been an issue we've talked about over a number of years.
It's funny you mention that because I just looked at that budget today.
Okay.
And we are 66% through the school year, and we're 66% through that budget as of today. So we're spending the money. As far as the availability of substitutes, are we actually getting all of our needs filled? That's something I can get some research and I can get back to you on that to see if we're actually filling all of the requests that we're putting out there each day.
Okay. Please go to someone else. 'Cause,
While you're
yeah.
looking at that, to clarify that, though, that the question about whether they're being filled every day isn't necessarily a financial one, it's availability of subs.
Yeah, there's a fill rate, and
Yeah.
I can talk to Patty, and we can bring
Yeah.
that information
Okay.
forward at the next meeting.
Are you done for now?
Yeah, for now.
Can I just want, this is more of a Jody question probably, but the question of the table that you had given us about the out-of-district placements and the different issues that the students have that send them out of district. So I noticed that the out-of-district placement cost overall has gone down. I presume some of that is aged out, maybe, but my question is, how much of that decrease is bringing kids back? And I also noticed, only one student is being sent out for communication. I'm not sure what that means, but I don't see, language acquisition, like dyslexia type issues going out anymore, which we used to send them out. And I know we've built the program in-house, so I'm just curious, is that decrease in out-of-district costs coming down because of the programs that we've built in-house. Do you mind? Is that okay?
Thank you. Didn't know I was going to put on the spot.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's for a variety of different reasons. Some students have transferred out to other districts. We've been able to maintain students and not send students out, as well as students aging out. So it's a variety of different reasons. And I will have all of that for my presentation. It's being bumped to not March 27th, but April
Due to the
10th.
snow, I didn't want to have
Okay.
three presentations from central office, or 4, counting mine. So Jody's will be the first meeting in April.
So it will be the profile of special education in Marlborough, so it will have a lot of stats and information breaking down out of district, in district programs, as well as, I think there was questions before about the number of students who are aging out, and I can give the 2 to 3 year projections on some of the decreases that we expect, barring any other students that move in or identified that need to go up.
Thank you.
Any other
Sorry to put you on the
No,
spot.
no, that's okay.
That's great.
Ready?
So, jumping back to the bus situation, is there a way with the, at least some of the examples that you were able to pull for us to understand what bus companies these folks are with? Whether it's like an NRT or AAA kind of thing, or AA or whatever it is, so we can have a little bit of an understanding what they are?
The business manager group that I'm part of is currently doing that data collection right now. We do it every year to determine who is with what bus company, what their costs are, all those types of things. So that way, all the business managers in the state have a kind of a better understanding. I will tell you that busing is definitely a regional issue, I guess you can say. So, for example, NRT owns a majority of the business in this region. So for someone to come into this region, they're gonna have to find a depot.
Right.
They're gonna have to be able to service several communities to make it worth their while. So there is a push and a pull there a little bit. And what I find is, some bus companies don't bid in other regions. They simply stay in their region and they don't really expand. The last time we put it out, I reached out to 6 or 7 bus companies, and the only 2 that came to the pre-bid meeting was First Student and NRT. First Student, has a depot here
Right.
in town, and NRT has one that's right over the border in Hudson, on Fox Road. So they're both very close, so they both know that they can service the contract. Whereas like an AA Transportation, which does Shrewsbury, would have more of a difficult, because we have to require in our contract that should there be an emergency, either in the schools or the city, that they have to respond within a certain amount of time.
Right.
So that requires them to either have a depot or somewhere to store the buses that they can get out emergency-wise and get out to all of our schools, and start, helping us with whatever crisis we have. So sometimes that can be a limiting factor when we talk about the transportation bid. We do require them to be able to respond to an emergency within, 15 minutes or however long we put in the contract. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's about that much time.
Is there a way that we could start to plan on gather ridership data over like a number of different dates, PM, AM, variations, so that we have a bit more than just, 1 day litmus test, of how many students and where we're gathering them from on a
Yeah.
regular basis?
It's something that we've been trying to work on, and one thing that is part of my goals this year is we really need to have like a bus pass system. We're not asking people to pay for it. We just need to know we need to be able to budget the seats, if you think about it.
Right.
Because I need to know how many seats I need to fill at each level. The elementaries already do a fantastic job with this. They're so organized, everything is color coded, like it's perfect. But at the secondary level, we need like a bus pass system to know who's actually riding the buses, so we can accurately deploy the fleet. Sometimes I have been at the high school and I see buses that are pretty empty in the afternoon. And it doesn't, but that flows. Like sometimes when an athletic ends, then all of a sudden there's a whole bunch more kids on the
Right.
bus. So we have to be able to flex a little bit, but we gotta know who's riding. And what we've been doing is basically publishing the routes and, putting it out there and saying, we're trying to basically route almost every kid in the district, because we want everyone to ride, but that's also very inefficient. So we're trying to work on that our end too,
Right.
to make sure that we know who's actually riding the bus.
I wonder also, flip side, we could also look at who would like to opt into car rider program, only because if you've looked at drop-offs, as Brian's there almost every single morning at the middle school, making sure that everything's flowing. There's a huge amount of kids that are doing drop-off on a regular basis. So, maybe that's something to also look at. If people want to opt in, we can use that information to understand who we don't have to worry about as far as for transportation. Trying to look at it maybe a little bit backwards might help a little bit.
And part of it, part of the discussion when we talk about the transportation is we go above and beyond, but we also really are sensitive to the fact that we want kids to come to school.
Right.
Right.
If we make it too restrictive and we make the walk too long, I don't want to put barriers in place of kids getting to the actual school. It's more about a discussion about what's reasonable. How do we look at this from a neighborhood aspect? Can there be things that we can do? The last thing we want to do is make it a blanket, 1.5 miles, no one can do X, Y, or Z. That I don't think will help us. I think that would actually hurt us and actually hurt the school's ability to have the kids coming on time, have the kids coming on a regular attendance. Those are the issues that we're going to have to grapple with a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Any other questions? Any other go, Ms. Ryan?
I think mine's just more of a clarifying question. I think you did touch upon this, but on page 12 of the book we have, it says the enrollment is 4,667, but back on page 8, what's submitted to the state says like 5,081. And I think you said that was because they count for out-of-district placements.
Yep.
So do we really have like 414 kids out-of-district?
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. We do. So we have probably about 87 at
So
Hudson.
here,
Sorry.
this question would have been answered if the snow hadn't intervened, because as part of my report for the March 13th, I did have some data on school attending, so I had wanted that to be presented before this, because I thought there might be that kind of question. So you're right, and more will be revealed on the 27th.
Ooh, the big
So
reveal.
you blew it.
Caught it.
Oh, no, it was a
Took
teaser.
the wind out of
It was
it.
a teaser.
But suffice
Thank
to
you.
say, it's charter school, choicing out, all that
Vocational
kind of stuff,
schools.
vocational schools, all that.
Gotcha.
Private
Okay.
schools.
Other
I think-
questions?
sorry.
Ms. Matthews?
So in the non-filled requests?
Yes. Not filled yet. That's what I like to think about.
Okay, the non-filled, the budget request from principals. That was, district believes we can fund the position in other ways. So this is the request that Principal Cleary put in for the reading teacher. You talk about the district using Title I funding,
Yes.
which we just talked about not trying to do, but this is a purpose, because but I guess my other concern too, and we talked about it in the scheduling and the discussion of the teaming, and the intervention is, again, number of minutes in a day. And when they reach 9th, 10th, 11th grade, there's not, I firmly believe, high school teachers were not designed to be teaching reading. And it becomes the challenge, and to not have sometimes some person, how do we minimize any losses of achievement at that point?
And we think, well, now that the MOU has been ratified, we can talk a little bit more openly. There are some positions at the elementary level that have been eliminated. There's no more academic specialists. That is no longer a position that we have in the district. So when we look at our total FTE across the elementary, there are gonna be some intervention positions that are reduced at the elementary level and increased at the secondary level. We are gonna be increasing at Whitcomb and the high school. So you've already heard, Principal Daniels came, I think, a couple meetings ago and talked about the plan to move some of the world language and add additional reading. We're looking beyond that to additionally look at all the interventions in the district and then reallocate them as needed to both Whitcomb and the high school. That's why we feel like we can we can actually fund that request, but it's gonna be from already existing funds.
Okay.
Sorry if that was a rambling
No,
answer.
no,
Swap out.
you answered the question. No, got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And along those lines, can I just request, I know I had spoken to you about this the other day. At some point in an upcoming meeting, can we get a, what do we call it? Personnel update as to, you know, where we were maybe in the beginning of the year, what positions have changed throughout. I know it's not a budget change, but a who's sitting in what seat and what are those seats changes, and with the implications for next year as well.
Absolutely. I can tell you an open position right now is behavior tech. But we
Please
can
apply
certainly do
online
that.
now.
Or to be a bus driver.
Or a bus driver, right? Call NRT and.
I'll enter if you want to be a bus driver.
Thank you.
Could use a parking clerk down on Main Street.
Oh, we got
Want to
some.
make a list? We could start making a list.
Just ours.
Chalk on the tires?
Yeah, the
Chalk on the tires.
tire chalker.
Oh. That's a,
That's enough.
We could do that this summer.
that's a terrible job.
Thank you.
Before you move.
We could do that this summer. It'd be fun.
What else? Any questions? Mrs. Ryan?
I have another question. Another one that you kind of touched on, but I just wanted to get some clarification. You mentioned about adding a fourth grade teacher to Kane. And I noticed in what we have, you also have already added back in the kindergarten teacher. So I wanted to see, are you talking about now adding 2 additional teachers to Kane?
Yeah, so if you look over in the right-hand column, the +1 is that we've added the kindergarten.
Kindergarten.
What I'm talking about is adding a 7th teacher
Yep.
to reduce the class sizes back down to about 21, a little bit, maybe a little bit less than 21.
And I think I know, but I don't know that the whole team knows. Is there space at Kane to add those 2 teachers back in?
I've been talking to the principal, Calliope, and we're working on a plan to try to make sure we can do that, but.
Calliope will now be on a cart.
So far, so good.
It's a good question. Good question.
It's a good question.
She went one way down that road, and I'm gonna take it a little bit further. So the 2 classrooms over at Jarrick, which right now are the 23.
Yep.
What's gonna be our threshold on trying to figure something else out? Or no, we can't because we have absolutely no space and Ron's not gonna go on a cart. I don't know, maybe he does.
You know, when we talk about thresholds, when we talk internally about threshold, we use 24. When we get above 24, we start to get really nervous. 24 actually happens to also be the threshold for the Massachusetts School Building Authority.
Yeah.
Which is, they're giving us a $30 million grant for the new building. So we kind of look at them, and they're trying to aggregate data from the whole state. I can tell you what the research says, and K1 and 2, they want to see lower class sizes, and
Yeah.
3 and 4, 23 is not out of the realm of normalcy across the state. But to answer your question, part of the problem is there is no more space at JARC. You know, we're going to be adding an additional Pathways classroom over there, and Ron's room isn't big enough for a classroom, so I can't put him on a cart. There's no other room really to go for.
Yeah, well, no.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Looking at Ron to make sure that I'm answering that question appropriately.
Also conference room as well, so.
Other questions?
Can I finish on another one? So, on the, request from Mr. Cleary, which was the reading support that Ms. Matthews was just talking about, can we just make sure that we are not gonna go down the route of the Title I grant money?
It's, part of the thing is the high school is the only school we have that doesn't receive the Title I grant funds. So what we would be doing is reallocating Title I within the district between Whitcomb and the elementaries,
Right.
and then using district resources
Okay.
to transfer
Just
for
wanted to
that
make sure.
position.
Okay.
We're already anticipating, if you looked at this figure, let me bring this back up, sorry. So when you look at that figure of the $764,000 we're receiving from Title I, we're anticipating next year that we're getting about 690. If we receive 764 and they just level fund us, win for us. That means we might be able to reestablish a summer school program, we might be able to do different things, but I am hesitant, and I think I've made that clear, I'm hesitant to keep on tying teachers to it, because it's, the revenue is not guaranteed.
Well, and, sorry, but if you look at Title II, it's not, that's going away. I mean, it's pretty
Betsy
evident.
DeVos
I
has
mean,
made that
that, yeah, we're, unless a huge amount starts changing at the federal level, which isn't yet, that's not happening, so. Okay.
I'm worried about IDA.
Other questions? Any other questions?
Well, I have one more.
Keep going.
My other question was, I think it's almost the last, actually, it's the last page, the capital request form for the replace Whitcomb curbing and asphalt. What does it mean, the island can be removed after work is complete? Is that like front loop? You're thinking about removing that island?
Potentially, in the future. I've talked to Andy White about it a couple times. There might be some benefits to us doing that, but that's a low priority item when we look at capital. So I would push that out pretty far. We talked about parking situations and how we want to do that, but right now I feel pretty good about the parking situation at Whitcomb compared to some of my other sites, which struggle a lot more. But I say in the future, that might be a potential thing we want to look at, but that's very low on my priority list for future monies.
My only concern with that is, I know sometimes you have the buses that do the drop-off in the morning, and when you have the drop-ins coming in, you have them on the other side of that island so they can pass those buses. So removing that, you now have, how are you gonna do your drop-off if you have buses there?
Yeah, and the other thing is we just built the road around the side of the school too, which is gonna help us out a little bit.
True.
It actually, Principal Daniels has already greatly improved the situation with the buses by having them all line up on the backside and using that road, which was established with the new turf field project. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. It's a beautiful field. So there's already been some operational improvement. And that's why I look at this request and it goes very, very far down the list. There's so many things that are much more important, and some of them have already been funded. So like, for example, this fall, City Council had given Mr. Galone funds to start all the fire panel replacement. So we're already starting to make some progress on some of these items, which is great.
What else? Ms. Hennessy?
Thank you. Back in the capital requests, replace roof at Wickham School. Where are we standing in regards to how many times we're having water coming through? Because I know it's been happening off and on.
Well, the storm we had a week and a half ago,
Stop.
part of the problem was the rain was coming in sideways. It got underneath the flashing and it made a little bit of a mess. I'd have to rely on Brian. Other than that one storm, which was rough, have you had issues with pooling on any other areas?
No, minimal, that storm was rough.
Yeah.
Even with the heavy snows, because I have to say that was one of the things that I was wondering about because of how that roofing is flat. Doesn't really.
It hasn't been a problem.
Okay, that's great.
And I agree, I was somewhat surprised at that. That driving rain was rough.
Okay. Then the other thing that I thought was interesting was the replace the bleachers at MHS, which I was, sorry, but I was kind of happier to see lower on the priority list.
Yeah, we also need to replace, one thing that I'm gonna be sending over, because I just got the request, we also need to start replacing the lockers in the locker rooms. They've had their time.
Yeah.
It's time to start moving them on. At some point, we do need to look at replacing the bleachers at the high school. I mean, at some point, we need to start doing that. It'd be nice to do it. I think they're manual, Charlie?
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of the newer systems don't require the custodian to literally break their back to get them out, so.
We can push for a while.
Yeah.
I'll help.
What else? Entertain a motion to approve? No one's going for it?
Yeah, I'll go for it. Motion to approve the superintendent's, I gotta get to the page, sorry. Sorry, where is it? There we go, sorry. Well, is this the correct number now with the budget B that you have?
No, but remember, everything stays at the 2.88%.
Okay. So, motion to approve the proposed superintendent's budget of, for FY '19, total budget $61,756,164, a 2.88% increase over FY '18.
Motion made and seconded to approve. I just, I have a question.
I do too.
No, I'm ready to go, but, are we approving, is everyone comfortable approving this before the public hearing?
I'm not, that's why I wanted to have.
Clarification. Mr. Bergeron.
Can I talk about that for 1 sec? Can I ask, instead of approving, what I might do is
Recommending?
accept,
Accept.
and then I can post the
Okay,
public
I'm
hearing.
sorry.
Unfortunately,
Correct.
Sorry. I
because
was
of
just
the
like, no, I'm
posting
not.
deadlines,
Yep.
we need to have this publicly in a newspaper for 7 days prior to the public hearing. So the public hearing won't be on the 27th. We're gonna need to push it to the next school committee meeting.
April 10th.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, it
But I
does.
thought we already posted a public hearing for that night.
We had put it on the budget document as the proposed, but we haven't published
We have
it
to
outside in
advertise
the
it.
newspaper yet. Because I need some feedback whether you're gonna accept or reject the superintendent's budget before I do that.
I thought you would have posted it. So it's 10 minutes to 7.
So that would be
9
on
o'clock's
April
deadline, right?
10th.
April 10th.
Does that meet your timeline? If we vote
We'll
on
be,
that?
the council will be done by then, but that's okay. It's happened before.
That's true.
10 of 7.
Oh, you're saying,
You
get
can go
it to
run
the
out and
newspaper.
post right now? Is that what you're thinking? Oh, that would be 7 days. Our meeting's not till 7:30.
I have to get it in the newspaper for 7 days. If I
Nice
can't
try.
get the
We
newspaper,
don't legally have to get it in the newspaper.
yeah.
We just have to post a public hearing.
Really?
Happy to do what the committee wants.
Sure.
Well, we want to follow the law. My question is.
Good
are you
answer.
correct or are you correct?
Good answer.
Good job, Michelle.
I guess because of the fact that it still has to go to you, it's more important for the public hearing in the.
Well, the public, and
City.
again, I'd have to technically check here, but there is no, I don't believe there is a legal requirement for a public hearing for the city budget. It's a courtesy that we do a public hearing
School budget.
automatically for the city council. But,
So, can I,
I don't
can
feel
I,
comfortable.
can I make a
approving the
motion
budget
to
without a public hearing.
accept the proposed, accept and put on file the proposed budget?
Superintendent's budget.
and we'll see what we can do.
And, yeah, and request that if the public would like to have a say about our budget, to please review it and come to Tuesday's meeting. If you want to post, you guys can figure that part out, but also, we could also get.
We'll send out a communication tomorrow after we review a couple of the rules and regulations, so everyone's comfortable.
Okay. So that's my motion to accept.
Motion to move it forward.
Discussion.
Question?
Yeah, I still really am concerned about the world language conversation that we had about the middle school. And I really would like to understand that a little bit more and how bodies are moving around to make that happen. So, I guess I'm just not quite sure I'm understanding who's not going to be receiving those services and who will be receiving those services, and then where is that money getting allocated to make sure that it's actually then supporting for their reading needs that we need for across the school.
Okay. I mean, it's something we'd have to
Sure.
bring back at a.
We will bring back those numbers and the answers to that next time.
That would be great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the motion to move it to the next school committee meeting? All those in favor? Opposed, carries. Thank you very much.
Motion to adjourn?
Motion made and seconded to adjourn. All those in favor? Opposed, carries. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. And Jody, you get special award for speaking tonight.